Welcome to Verses and Visions Creative Conversations, where creativity and purpose meet to inspire and uplift. I'm Cassidy Beck, your host, here to explore the stories of artists, dreamers, and changemakers who are walking in faith and using their unique gifts to make a difference. Each episode is a reminder that your vision, paired with God's purpose, can transform the world around you. Let's get started and spark some inspiration together.
At Verses and Visions, we're grateful for partners who support creativity, faith, and meaningful conversations. We're pleased to share a message from one of them.
Hey friends, before we jump into today's conversation, I've been thinking about those small, meaningful things that bring us together. For me, that's often sharing a bottle from my family's premium soda company, Soda Bears. Whether it's crisp ginger beer, smooth butterscotch beer, classic root beer, original apple beer, or apple beer 5, our low-calorie twist, each flavor is a small little reminder of home and of the simple joys. Okay, now let's dive in. Welcome to the podcast, Verses and Visions. I'm your host, Cassidy Beck, and I am really excited to this conversation today with Michael Hawkins. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you so much. I've been so looking forward to this.
So Dr. Michael Hawkins grew up in Western Idaho and served his mission in the Philippines. After graduating from BYU, Dr. Hawkins received his PhD in 2009 and worked as a history professor for 15 years. He is the author of numerous books and articles, including Making Morals, Semi-Civilized, and his latest offering, Infinite Contingencies, in 2025, which takes an innovative and inspirational look at Latter-day Saints doctrine and practice. Okay, so before we really dive into it, I just want to start with this. What are you currently curious about? Either it could be academically, spiritually, creatively.
Yeah, 100%. So right now I'm kind of obsessed. So whenever I have a research or a book project, I get consumed by it. So I tend to be obsessive. I try to put that to good use in terms of writing. Right now, I am currently kind of obsessed with the ethics, the philosophy of ethics and LDS doctrine as found like in the Book of Mormon and a couple of other places, because I find a variety of ethical systems active simultaneously throughout the scriptures. So we see consequentialism and we see sort of a Kantian approach to duty and we see virtue ethics. I am really right now trying to put together a book in my head that would explore each of these ethical philosophies relative to either instances in the scriptures or commands from God, and how it kind of fits into a totality of maybe not a Mormon ethical system, but ethics as we view it through the scriptures as Latter-day Saints.
Wow, that sounds awesome. And I love your approach to that. So growing up, you had incredible communications. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, growing up, one of the great Sunday traditions in my house was we'd all go to church, we'd come home, and it wasn't even planned. So I love things in my house that were organic. So it wasn't like, okay, kids, gather up. It's time. We're going to have a conversation about the gospel. And we'd all stare at each other and try to think of something. It would typically be a question that we had from Sunday school or something we'd been thinking about or something we read in the scriptures. And all of a sudden, a sort of robust debate would emerge where somebody would assert something and then somebody else would say, yeah, I don't know though, because Joseph once said, and that's all it took. Once you said that, yeah, there was a race was on. We were at home pulling books off the shelves and setting them down. And my grandmother, Grandma Jenner, as we called her, was really kind of the glue that held all this together. She was a prolific gospel scholar, grew up in the deep South during the Depression. Her family immigrated to Utah because of financial hardship. And then she grew up in that kind of 1940s era and never went to college, but was one of the most intelligent gospel scholars I've ever met. And so she would start pulling things in an age before the internet where she's like, Pratt wrote The Key to the Science of Theology. We should check. Oh, no, Brigham wrote, and she pulled the books off. And so I feel like between my grandma Jenner and my mom, the amount of books that they sort of in the back of their mind could reference almost made me say, okay, well, I'm going to get every one. I'm going to read every single one of these. I'm going to highlight every single one of these. I'm going to write comments in the margins of every single one of these. And it really kind of led me, I think, eventually on a path towards scholarship as a career in a different vein. But now it's weird how the journey of life is that I went off, I did my intense sort of scholarship, and now I've come full circle back where I think for most of the rest of my life, I kind of want to publish on this subject, maybe with some exceptions, but I find deep satisfaction in this sort of more accessible, speaking to my people, to my community. I don't know, it feels good. It feels good in a way that other scholarship has not hit me.
So there, I feel like one of my most frustrating firesides that I ever went to was there was a gentleman that asked like a deep, profound question, and it was like a really important one. And then he just kept asking it, but not like in a way that was helpful or that like provided an answer. And it was just out there into the void. And
Mhm.
it like was a really important question that we should grasp, but then
Yeah.
there was no like, and this is what I thought. And I love the premise of your book because you're asking those like really important questions, but it's also not just like, well, I'm just gonna drop that there. Good luck. But you've got like really a lot of research, deep thoughts. And so you're giving a deep question, but then you're like giving background and information and helping guide people through your thought process.
Well, thanks. Yeah, and those were kind of the rules I had to stick by because I'm like you. I don't want to pick up a book and have them pose a question and then be like, boom, mind blown, deal with it. My premise was here's a question that I have been grappling with, but the question in my mind has reached some level of resolution that I think is pretty valid that we can explore and discuss. And so every single one of them had to be questions that had at least a viable answer in the article within the book. I didn't want to just ask a question, and I didn't want to ask questions that we could speculate on outside, too far outside of the canon, because I think we also get too much of that, where and then people veer off into counterfactuals and well, what if in the preexistence this had happened? Well, we don't have any evidence for these what ifs. And so it's fun maybe sometimes informally to sit around and just speculate and pass the time. But I don't think that it builds anyone's testimony in a way that they could answer a question on the street where somebody says, look, reconcile to me God's omniscience with free will. And at least now, I don't know if I'm right about it. We'll have to wait and see until we get to the other side. But I think I would at least have a viable answer to say, here's my opinion on it. And I think it's well reasoned and well researched and rooted in the scriptures. And so that I think is a good launching off point for getting a more sure knowledge, a more sure testimony of those kind of things.
I am a very big fan of questions, but I think there are questions that, like, if not handled delicately, could kind of like be more damaging. So, that being, let me ask the next question. Was there a particular question or tension for you that started Infinite Contingencies?
It really was the title article. Ever since I was a kid, I have really struggled with this idea of agency because I feel it, I believe it, I know it has to be. And yet at the same time, I was comforted and also troubled because you get a lot of the cliches anytime life has something good or bad happening, right? Where they're like, well, this is what God intended. This is your car broke down so you wouldn't miss you wouldn't, get in a crash or whatever. And I felt comforted by that, but I also felt then why am I trying to do anything then? Right? Why not sit back and just enjoy the ride and let God take me where he's going to take me no matter what? And then as I got older, I began to think, plus, if he knows the future, then for me to act in any way that's contrary to that known future is necessarily a violation of omniscience. And if somebody's going to violate a law, it's probably going to be me, right? Not him. And so very much struggled with that question and have thought about it ever since I could consciously think about it, middle school maybe. And so that was something that I began to work out. And as I came across what I thought was a viable answer, I was like, wow, that feels good. I need to write it down in a way that I can remember it. And then there were other things in the scriptures that I would run across. I thought, well, as long as I'm trying to solve that, let me solve this. I've always been troubled by what I perceive to be the unfairness to the older brother and the prodigal son. I've always been troubled by the fact that Jesus would leave his 99 to go after one and sort of forsake the care of the 99 for the one. And I was troubled by that. And I was troubled by Abraham and Moses bargaining with Jehovah and sort of changing his mind about things. And how could that happen? And so one by one, I began to take these things that sort of stuck in my mind and that had been dismissed for the most part in my youth. And I don't mean by my family, but by other people where I would ask a question. They're like, well, we don't know. Okay, his ways are higher than our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. This is something that we just are not meant to understand. And I was like, I don't accept that. Then if that's the case, then why am I reading the story? If you're conceding the fact I'll never understand it, let's skip it. Let's go on to stories we do understand. And so I felt one by one in the book, as I was solving these problems, it felt good in a way that like the momentum was building. And I'm like, oh no, I'm actually solving problems that have bothered. I've just never sat down in a way that I could think about it and write about it to the point that I'm satisfied with at least my idea of what the solution is.
So I'm curious because I feel like your work often sits at the intersection of belief, culture, and complexity. So what have you learned about holding faith while honestly engaging with this difficult or uncomfortable history sometimes?
That is such a good question. So, by training, I'm a social and cultural historian. So, I feel like, for me at least, it's so much easier for me to digest either the Old Testament, which sometimes people find disturbing, or even elements of church history, because I realize that all human beings are products of whatever culture they're living in, right? So, the beliefs, the values, the manifestation of those beliefs and values, and everything from high art to music to what we think is polite and impolite and beautiful and ugly. I've always been pretty centered in that, where I'm okay with that. And so I feel like in the Old Testament, people can kind of brush it off. So it was a long time ago. It was the olden days, right? People of it. It was the olden days. But in 19th century church history, I have seen visible like discomfort, anger, hopelessness, where people are trying to sort some of these things out. In particular, I mean, in the article in the book, I addressed Joseph's, what I believe was actually his process of translation of the Book of Mormon, because obviously the Abrahamic scrolls, the fragments which were found in the museum in New York, people have been troubled about, or the fact that sometimes he needed the Urim and Thummim, sometimes not. Sometimes he had the plates under a blanket, was translating. Sometimes he was looking at the plates and translating. And people are saying, well, how am I supposed to make sense of any of this? And once in the book, I was trying to establish a kind of, well, here's what I think his process was. And I think there's precedent for this throughout the scripture. So Joseph was not unique. He's another in a long line of prophets in the scriptures that seem to use a similar process. It's just his 19th century American culture, the process played out like this. And so I feel that by understanding those contexts, everything comes together in a way that you're like, oh, okay, then I don't have to be very disturbed about that, because I live in 2026. And if I was to go back even 80 years and to tell people, well, in the future, we'll all kind of work in like a service industry where we sit and type on a keyboard and work on the internet, they wouldn't have understood any word that I said in that sentence except work. We have to similarly understand that in the past, if Joseph was to explain his day to us right now, we wouldn't understand 60% of what he was saying, simply because we don't live that agricultural life. We don't live that 19th century life. And coming to understand the nuance of that is so important, because we have a tendency in the church to think of gospel things as eternal. And what we mean by that is that the communication with God is eternal, the principles eternal, revelation is eternal. The methods are not. The methods are very time specific, culture specific, geographically specific, and we have to understand that we can tease those things out. And I feel like when I would teach gospel doctrine, and I could kind of do like a cultural setting, and then we could talk about the doctrines of the church, people were a lot more willing to like accept it. I get a lot of people like, oh, I hate Old Testament. I don't want to learn about the Old Testament. It's very disturbing. Like the killing, the sexuality, all that in the Old Testament, I hate. It's okay, but let's explore it first, right? And then we'll look at how gospel principles are playing out in their world, because it's a temporal world.
That's such an interesting take, and how important. And I think what a as a historian and as someone that has developed so many talents around that, I think what a unique position and perspective that you have for scripture and for these things. And I think it's really cool.
Thank you.
So the title Infinite Contingencies suggests openness, it suggests possibility and choice. What does that title mean to you personally?
So it's kind of my theory that I think about in terms of what it means for God to be omniscient and reconcile that with agency. And so it's my personal belief that at any given moment, when we say God sees the future, we think of a static future. Like he sees event Z when we're at C. He sees event C occurring in 2029, and that's the truth, right? Because God is truth. And so the question that's posed to us is, okay, then Z is inevitable. So if Z is I win the sweepstakes, then no matter what I do, I'm going to win that sweepstakes, no matter what. My theory is that God sees a variety of contingent futures that are relative to our agency, and he sees them all at once. He can see every road and every divergence, every decision and every decision off of that decision, really in an infinite way. And as we make decisions, those infinite contingencies collapse into what actually has happened. And because our God is omniscient, whatever those decisions collapse into in terms of this is where Mike's at in his life, as I point out in the book, I find it the deepest comfort that God says, okay, I can work with that. That's okay. Let's work with that. And for me, this explains all of the things in scripture that people have told me. Things like, oh my gosh, was Judas destined to kill Jesus? By having Judas born at the time he was born, his fate was sealed. If we already knew Jesus would be betrayed. And how could Jesus have passed on the cup? And how could all of Jacob's son lose the birthright until Joseph? And how could, Oliver and be commissioned for a mission to the Lamanites and be stopped by government bureaucrats? And all of these instances in church history, weren't we going to inherit Zion? And then, the Missouri massacres occurred and they were kicked out of Missouri. And people like to medicate this. And it's always been a personal pet peeve. No offense to anybody out there who said this, but it's always been a pet peeve of mine that I look at the sacrifice and the faith of those saints in Missouri, and it like brings me to tears. Like they're the people I want to be. And I hear people brush it off like, well, they weren't righteous enough. It was their fault. You know what I mean? Like they weren't obedient. I was like, well, if they're not, then I'm definitely not going to go where they're at. Right. So there's no hope for me. Whereas, look, life intervenes, agency intervenes. And the Lord looked at it and he said, I can work with that. I can work with that. Let's go to Salt Lake, right? You didn't get a mission to the Lamanites. Hey, let's work with it. We'll do something else. We'll get converts in Ohio and build branches there. It's all good. And so by seeing this infinite contingency of possibilities, one by one, those infinite contingencies will collapse into something and then things will branch off of that. And so think of it like your patriarchal blessing. Right. I've talked to a lot of youth and they're like, I'm not getting mine because I don't want to know what's in the future. I don't want to know that I'm going to get married, or I don't know that I'm going to do this or that. And I always explain to them, we're not casting bones here, right? We're not like divining information. What you're seeing is an infinite number of possibilities available to you in the future, depending upon your agency. And these are the good possibilities for you, tailored to your personality, your talents, your particular circumstance. These are the most likely wonderful things that can happen in your life. But sure, at any moment, you can choose to go off the rails. You can choose to move to the North Pole. You can choose to end your life. You can choose a variety of things that would collapse all of those things into nothing. And so I kind of explore in the book using scriptural examples of times the Lord prophesied and it didn't come about, but then there was an alternative. Or in the book where, for example, Joseph looks into heaven and sees his brother in the celestial kingdom, and his brother's work hadn't even been done. And so people are like, what is going? So is it destined that Alvin would accept his work? Is it destined that he was to be exalted? Are we some kind of Calvinists in our approach that, we're predestined for salvation? And my argument is no, Joseph was seeing in a contingent future. And Alvin at any time could have rejected the work that would be done for him. But that was a likely possibility, and the Lord was revealing it to Joseph. And I feel the same with like Nephi. When he beholds the destruction of his people, the immediate philosophical question we encounter is like, okay, that's a done deal then. They were always going to be destroyed. They were always going to commit societal suicide. Then you think, well, what was the point? Right? What was the point of it all? But I think Nephi was being shown a likely contingent future. And who knows, but Mormon edited it in ways that it was a teleological thing when he edited it, because Moroni Mormon and Moroni were witnessing the collapse of the civilization. So when they're sorting through all the records, they're telling the story of their present. But for all we know, Nephi was seeing futures of prosperity and beauty and things like that. But, Mormon is a historian. Moroni is a historian. And so they're naturally telling the prophetic history of the moment they encounter. And so all history was leading to this point. And it's a bias that we have. I know this is super nerdy, but it's called a teleological bias, where we can only tell the history of the present as leading to the present.
Here, I feel like I am understanding what you're saying, but I just feel like there's kind of a bridge in my mind that's broken a little bit. From my understanding, God's perspective, and it's hard to totally understand God's perspective. But the way that is explained to me is that if you think like Australia, they're on a totally different time zone right now. So they're in the future, but right now it is kind of present. And
Mhm.
so that is my little understanding of like how I thought God could be omniscient is
Mhm.
that he was looking, but like in his time, it's like all time, it's like all time that he's able to see. So help me bridge what you're saying and my limited understanding.
No, I mean, I think you're right. And he says several times in the scriptures, like, all time is before me, right? And you're correct. So if I was omniscient, I could see, even though it's tomorrow or this evening in Australia, maybe, and I can see what's happening there, even though they exist in a different time. We're inhabiting this simultaneous moment in North America and in Australia, right? So we're still moving forward in time in a way that Australians don't know what's going to happen 1 minute from now, and I don't know what's going to happen 1 minute from now. The idea is God can see beyond the timeline. So time is this really weird thing I think about a lot, but Neil A. Maxwell just inspires me, where he's like, this is not our natural element, right? We weren't meant to live in time. And that's why we call this the temporal world, is because everywhere I go and everywhere I look, there is this impenetrable black temporal veil in front of my face where I can't see 1 nanosecond ahead of me. Whereas in space, I can look around and I can see what's coming and I can adapt to it. And I literally don't know what's going to happen 30 seconds from now. And this is, I think, the real challenge of mortality. It's what binds us to faith and things like that, is all of our anxieties that we feel are not knowing what's going to happen 30 seconds from now. And the Lord obviously does. He does know what's going to happen 30 seconds from now. And so the question that binds me is, if he knows what's going to happen 30 seconds from now, then he could make a truth statement about 30 seconds from now. He could say, in 30 seconds, Mike is going to stand up. And because God is truth, in 30 seconds, I must stand up. And so the question is, was it inevitable that I was always going to stand? And then did I have any choice in the matter? My theory is that God sees 30 seconds from now, but he sees Mike stands up, Mike remains seated, Mike falls out of his chair, Mike props his feet up, all of these things. But the Lord, of course, can figure, in terms of everything that's going on, to almost to a certainty the probability of what Mike will do. But we have numerous examples throughout the scriptures where things that were pronounced as prophecies did not occur. And there's two choices for me, two choices we have at that point. Choice number one is, okay, it's prophecies are false, right? They never were prophecies. And how do we know if a prophecy is true or not? Because it didn't come about. Or the Lord was articulating one possible, the best possibility in the future that he sees as valid, like our patriarchal blessings. And then when it didn't come about, that's because agency intervened. But the Lord also saw that agency could intervene, and this could be the alternative. So it's not that the Lord is guessing, and I don't want to make that my argument. The Lord is not guessing about the future. He actually sees it. He sees all of them. And as they go about, he naturally sees them as they're happening and as they can happen. And so I think the patriarchal blessing is probably the best example of it. You know, for in mine, it said, you know, you'll find someone, you'll marry them, you'll do all these various things. And those were things I don't think the Lord was saying, like, here's some options for you. I think he saw a scenario in which I was married and had kids. He probably also saw scenarios in which I wasn't and didn't have kids because I made horrible choices. And every one that he saw was as valid as every other, but just depended upon me actually making the choice.
We'll return to today's conversation in just a moment.
You know how much I love sharing stories that inspire faith and hope. I'm excited to tell you about my new children's book, Sheep Chronicles Baptism, releasing September 1st. It's about Joshua, a curious boy with big questions about baptism, and the parable of a lost sheep named Shannon, shared by his wise grandpa. It's been such a joy to write this story, and I can't wait for you and your family to read it together.
Now back to the episode.
So I'm curious, as you were writing this, were there moments in this book when you like, and I feel like it was a little bit of a wrestle writing this book, but was there any moments that your own assumptions or even your faith were stretched or a little bit deepened?
Yeah, there definitely were. Throughout your life, you should always be exploring the perimeters of your ignorance, right? Like continually every day finding out what it is I know and what it is I don't know. And one of the greatest things I always loved as well is, Socrates knew he was the wisest man in Athens because he was the only one that knew that he knew nothing. And I found that as I was exploring things, I would have an idea and I would say, this is going to make a great article. And as I would research it, I would have to sort of, again, explore the perimeters of my ignorance. And I would have to concede the fact that, okay, Mike, you don't know as much about this as you need to, or maybe you have hit a wall. And when you hit a wall, what are you going to do now? And it makes faith a conscious decision where you can actually say out loud, I don't know to this moment. And I don't know. At this point, what do you do with that? And I think you have to consciously, almost out loud, say, at this point on this subject, I'm going to have faith in it. And to me, that it is so helpful to make those delineations because I also think it's, gosh, I feel like I'm mean sometimes, but I feel like it's a lazy statement sometimes where there are questions that have answers and people are like, well, the gospel's just simple. We don't need to worry about that. I mean, really, at the end of the day, it's very simple and we just need to live. And I was like, and I admire that approach. And sometimes I wish I was satisfied with that approach, but I'm like, okay, if that's the case, then why are we given so much complexity? Just read the Doctrine and Covenants theologically will blow your mind. Why would the Lord drop those theological, beautiful bombs on us if we were meant to say like, well, I'm really not going to worry about anything he said in 76. And I'm not going to worry about anything he said in 88. And I'm not going to worry about anything, because in the end, the gospel's simple. So be nice, and follow the commandments. For me, that's never been enough. I can't live that way for me, but also you have to put a limit on that to say like, okay, if I don't know the answer, I'm not going to believe in it. Right. If I run into a wall on this, then for me, I'm not going to worry about this or that. And so it's a negotiation, I think, throughout our lives. And again, my intellectual model in the church is really Neil A. Maxwell. I think he was so beautiful at this, where he would explore, he would articulate, he would reason. And then sometimes in his talks, he would say, but on this, I don't know, we have to have faith. I'd be like, you're speaking to me. You're speaking to me.
And you are speaking to me right now because this is actually like an approach that I really like, and I feel like you're saying a similar thing. It was talking about like this is in Nephi when an angel had come to him and said, so this first Nephi 11, 16, and 17, where he said, knowest thou the condescension of man? Sorry, of God. And Nephi said, I know that he loved his children. Nevertheless, I do not know the meaning of all things. And what I love about that so much, and I feel like this is the approach that you literally were just talking about, is that like I feel like the sense I'm getting from Nephi is I am humble. Like I know the things I don't know, but also I'm faithful and I know that there are and that I'm hungry for more information. And I think those three things, like the humility that like we don't know it all, the thirst for more knowledge, and faith, I think those three things together can be very powerful. And it seems like those are things that you used in your research and in your book. Your thoughts?
No, I love it. And I think you're 100% correct. And I love his even answer with that he doesn't shrug it off. He's like, nah, I never heard of that before. You know what I mean? He's like, okay, I think I understand what you're trying to say. Here's as far as my knowledge goes. I know he loves people. I know that God has right now condescended to me in the form of you, right? Taking me on this path. I don't know. Tell me about it, And I feel like that is like sort of the perfect intellectual approach of, I don't know. I'm not going to pretend to know. Nephi didn't make up an answer like, yeah, of course. My dad told me about that. I know. You know what I mean? Of course. I could just imagine Spirit shaking his head. Like, you're going to be hard. Yeah, it's going to be a tough nut to crack. Add to me. And I think that when you actually take that approach, you are added upon in ways that suddenly, and this is how I found revelation takes place. It's so subtle and it's untying a knot. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, it's loose. Oh, and it just makes sense. But it's not in a thunderstruck way. It's like in a way that it always made sense. And you're just now noticing it, at least for me. And then you're like, oh, okay, I have resolution. Let me move on to this other thing. But then once you reach that resolution, what makes me think it is a form of revelation is whenever I encounter that again, I don't go back and second think and be like, okay, maybe, oh, no, no. I feel like I still feel good with that. I feel good with that solution. I don't think it's complete, but I feel good with that solution. And that contentment in the knowledge is such a great feeling to me because in my other scholarship, there never is final resolution, right? The story's never told. There's never an absolute truth. There's never a complete narrative of the past or anything like that. But with gospel things, there can be a certain amount of resolution that you can't achieve anywhere else.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I love it so much. So, I guess my next question, a lot of listeners might wrestle with doubt or uncertainty as they're growing. How do you personally make space for questions without losing your spiritual grounding?
One thing I have encouraged people to do is embrace your doubts, right? Embrace them. So it's almost like I was talking to this person the other day who's a neuroscience and a psychologist and all this. And he was laughing because he gets a lot of students in college to come up and they're like, oh no, I'm going through a breakup, you know. And he says, you got to embrace it, like embrace it, embrace that this hurts, embrace that this is difficult, embrace that this is an unhappy part of life. And I think if people run from their doubts, they'll always catch you. They're going to find you out because wherever you go, there you are. And there your doubts are. And I've run into way too many people that when a difficult subject comes up, they're like, that's none of my business. I don't need to think about that. I don't want to know about that. I don't want to. And my idea is, look, if you're that scared of just losing your testimony with one thing, if you're that scared that finding out something is going to ruin your relationship with God, then maybe there are more fundamental things you need to look at. You know what I mean? If that it's almost like I look at it like a relationship or a marriage or something like that, and you're like, oh no, if I hear my spouse smack when they eat their food, this I can't be with them anymore. You got deeper problems, friend. You really need to work on your relationship. And I feel like a kind of intellectual fear relative to doubts is more destructive than the doubts themselves because I'm always running and hiding from something I should be embracing. And if there is a way that you can find the answer to your doubt, find it. It's not going to come. There's not going to be like a 3-word answer to it. There's not going to be a simple, oh, yeah, if you put this and this together, then it all makes sense. The omniscience agency question I struggled with for 45 years, less than, I guess, however long I was conscious of it, right? Struggle with that for that many years. Or you, like I said, run into a wall and you say, I am not going to discover what this is right now. So I'm going to have faith that the Lord articulated the best he could to my simple mortal mind. And it's probably him actually trying to talk about me working on the internet on a keyboard in the service industry to someone that lived 200 years ago. And I'll be okay with that. And that's where I have to have faith. And that's where I with comfort can say, I've explored it to its perimeter. I've exhausted what I know to do to figure it out. I don't know. So at this point, I guess I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to accept it and go on faith and assume that there is a better answer, but I just wouldn't comprehend it if he gave it to me.
I love it. And I was thinking earlier where you were talking about, and I think like the one that you're talking about right now, where it's like a deep wrestle that lasts for like a very long time, and just being like finding satisfaction with, okay, this is what I know for now, and that will be enough. I think that there another time where you were talking about like a different kind of revelatory experience where you're like, oh, that is so obvious. It's like right in front of my face. And yet, like, that's the first time I've ever seen it this plainly. And I think that I've had both. I've had both experiences where, okay, I'm just going to leave it. And also the time where that is as obvious as the nose on my face. And yet, this is the first time I've ever, like, thought of it that way. So I feel like I have experienced both of those things that you're talking about.
I think 100%. And I often appeal to Maxwell, but I think it was him that said, like, revelation is often a process of remembering, right? So when I see something that suddenly is clear, I'm like, oh, yeah, I guess I always knew that. You know what I mean? And that's really how it feels to me. In terms of the other, and I've tried to reconcile this as well, because on my mission, I was pretty ignorant. You know what I mean? It's amazing. I served a 2-year mission and taught the gospel for 2 years at the level of knowledge that I had. But what sustained me was at that point in my life, I really wasn't worried about figuring it all out. I was so caught up in the magic of the experience and just in our evangelical friends talk about it, but just being enraptured, where I'm like, hey, I don't know the answer, but I don't care because this is incredible what I'm experiencing right now. Right. And so even though I don't understand all these things, they have to be true because of what I'm feeling right now is the greatest thing I've ever felt in my life. And so that level of like, I'm borrowing a lot of terms that aren't quite LDS, but that level of what, again, my evangelical friends would be almost like charismatic euphoria made the rest of it irrelevant. But look, I was on a 2-year mission. I was dedicating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to, we one time counted up how many times we prayed in the day. And it was some absurd number. I mean, we're playing like 35 times a day. And you get out in the real world, you can't do that anymore. That's just not the life you can live. And so your approach has to become a little bit different. I'm not enraptured in the euphoria anymore. I got to pay electric bills and deal with sick kids and flat tires and things like that. And so what I think I had to do then was pursue not so much just the euphoric experience, but a revelatory exploration and understanding of it. And I think those are life cycles. And I've come to terms with that when you're young and you're invincible and you're idealistic, man, we're the luckiest people in the world that we get to experience like missions and things like that. And then when you get older and you gotta find your way in the world, we're also incredibly lucky because the body of intellectual literature, theological literature that our people produce. I mean, you walk into a Deseret book in Utah and you're like, this is amazing. And this is like a fraction, this is a drop in an ocean of literature produced by our people. What a time to be alive. What a community to be a part of, that we're this prolific in our publishing and our thinking and our reasoning and our explanation, our research, and our simple like testimonies and all that. Man, what a crazy group of people we are. Crazy exceptional. And I think in terms of the life cycles, that's at least been mine. I don't know if it's on target, but it's how mine has been at least.
So I'm curious, as someone that has studied a lot of history, what has history taught you about God's patience with imperfect people? And what has he taught you about yourself?
Really good question. So one of the things I loved about being a historian is I'm a social and cultural historian, right? So I don't do political history, military history, economic history, those kinds of things. What I study is the human experience. And my entire life, I've been fascinated by human beings. I think we're the most amazing, beautiful, inspiring, infuriating, stupid, and mean things that ever existed. And so to project that into the past, I always get people, they say, oh, you're a history professor, right? Well, doesn't history repeat itself? And I'm like, oh man, okay. Yeah, no, it doesn't, because 2025 has no historical analog. Okay. There's no year I can point to and there's our corresponding point. But I will say this, human beings are remarkably consistent over time, again and again and again. And no matter the culture, the time, the religion, whatever. And so being a historian is widely broadened my view of the human experience relative to God's plan. Because another problem that LDS people really run into is, oh my gosh, we're such a small fraction of human beings that have ever lived on this planet. I mean, when you consider members of the church, even in its ancient iterations, relative to the wider world, I couldn't even guess a percentage, but certainly a fraction of 1%. What does that mean for us? Do you know what I mean? What does that mean for us? Are we that lucky? Are we that exceptional? Are we that? And pretty soon you come to realize, like, yes, in some ways, but also no, in a lot of ways, right? That human beings throughout history have been exactly like us, and they've experienced God in the ways that God was able to let them experience it. And whether that's ancient Israel killing animals and spilling blood all over the place, or Chinese attempts to carve out an ethical system that demonstrates our Christ-like obligation to one another throughout the generations and throughout the patriarchal line and all that, without even, referencing Jesus. They're doing the same thing we're doing. They're living the same kind of journey towards the divine that we're living. And so to find myself in the history of that is comforting, and to find them in the history of that is more comforting, because I think there's way too narrow a focus, in terms of like God's chosen. Here's the interactions with God. But when you zoom out, I've had so many people that this is maybe one of the most damaging things to their testimony, where they zoom out and they're like, oh gosh, on the larger collage of humanity, Israel's a little dot, right? The restored church is a little dot. And that's all it adds up to. What are we supposed to make of this ocean of what's going on outside? And so I feel like being a social and cultural historian has allowed me to see remarkable consistency across space, time, culture, that we're living the same life God intended for all his children from the beginning. And I find comfort in that.
Okay, so what is one truth, either historical, spiritual, or personal, that you're still learning to live into?
Really good question. So some of the truths that I'm working towards are commandments that I feel could be very cultural or historically specific. Whereas we tend to think God's commands are eternal, but we see they frequently change. When I was on my mission, now missionaries don't do dumb things like this, but they're like, well, Jesus, he didn't drink wine. It was just grape juice, and Joseph didn't drink wine. It was just grape juice. But the Jews, if they could see into the future, they'd be like, well, Mike's not really eating pork, right? He's eating something else. He can't be eating pork. He can't be a baptized member of the church and eating pork. And sometimes particularly in modern church history, and sometimes struggle to find when prophets have personal preferences as to cultural articulations of eternal values and want to codify those into commandments, and to say like, okay, we be faithful and we'll live them. But at the same time, if I'm going to feel bad about myself, what should I feel bad about myself about? Because I find that, especially with the youth and the rise of anxiety and stuff, there's so much anxiety over, I'm doing this wrong, I'm doing that wrong. I mean, I write an article in there regarding perfectionism and some of the toxic nature of that, well outside of the Mormon Belt and the Intermountain West. And a lot of people would ask me this very sincere, and I mean in good faith, not being snide or smart alecky or anything, but they're like, Mike, do you really think when you get to the other side and you look back on your life that you're going to feel immense regret and self-loathing and all the things we talk about because you drank some coffee or you had some caffeine or something like that? Or are your regrets going to be focused on, I should have been better to this person. I should have been nicer to this person. I should have helped these people when I could have. I shouldn't have been so self-centered. I should have spent more time in prayer and reflection instead of scrolling TikTok. And my genuine, I have a lot of really good evangelical friends. This is one of the things that they struggle to reconcile with a lot of what they know is the stereotypical LDS, which is word of wisdom, those kinds of things. And they're like, do you ever think you're missing the point of it all if you're obsessing about some of these more cultural things as opposed to the actual Christian values? Did I give everyone the benefit of the doubt? Did I look at everyone the way Christ looks at them? Or was I casting stones at myself mostly? And I sometimes struggle, and I'm not telling people out there to go, pick and choose what commandments you want to follow. But in terms of focused obedience, in terms of focused efforts, and in terms of focused self-criticism, what should I actually be focusing on? I know people that are upset with the church will often point to the fact, and I listen mostly because I have a lot of friends who have, in some ways, just disassociated. And they say, look, I don't get it. This person X has never tasted alcohol, has never tasted caffeine, or has never done whatever, but he treats his wife terrible. And in his business, if he can, he'll cut corners and cheat people when he does it. And they go on listing these things that are fundamentally unchristian. But then we'll say, but, he follows this word of wisdom, so he's okay that way. From people inside the institution and people outside the institution, reconciling what Christ, I think, would call the weightier matters, and discerning exactly what those are relative to, I don't want to say the lighter matters, but in the New Testament, that the bad guys were the Pharisees and the Sadducees that were so hung up on the ticky-tack of the law and viewed themselves as irrevocably saved and righteous because they were observant to the law. And Christ is going, okay, well, when you get to the other side, he's posing that question. When you get to the other side, you really going to look back and say like, oh, I'm so glad. I wish I would have adhered more to the law of Moses, as opposed to, I wish I would have loved the Samaritan. I wish I would have loved and been merciful to the woman taken in adultery. I wish I would have praised the widow for giving her mite and all this other stuff. And so sometimes I think focus in the church and out of the church is a big issue. I have to tread lightly. I'll be honest. I have to tread lightly because I feel like you never want to be critical of the brethren or things that have been said from the pulpit or whatever. And so I never want to say like this over focus on X, Y, or Z is at the expense of weightier matters because I don't want to criticize. But in my personal teaching, I can say, look, obviously we want healthy bodies, and that's the point of the word of wisdom, right? We want to take care of these wonderful things to be in service of others. But in the end, when you get to the other side, I'm going to bet that the things you're thinking about most is how you treated your kids and how much you loved your neighbor and the time that you had an opportunity, to maybe help that lady in front of you out with her groceries and you didn't because you were stuck on your phone. Those are the things I think are going to haunt you. And so focus, I guess, is my big spiritual question, and how to reconcile obedience with proper focus.
So my last question, where can people connect with you? How can we support you?
Awesome. Yeah. So I am available on all the social medias. Look me up. My name is Michael Hawkins. The book is Infinite Contingencies. It has its own Facebook page. So you can look on that Facebook page and just Infinite Contingencies, and you'll see my picture there. I respond to everybody. I love it. I get all kinds of questions in email, and I get all kinds of questions on social media. There's a website I haven't maintained much, just called drmichaelhawkins.com. It's more oriented towards my academic career. Yeah, reach out any way you want to hit me up and we'll talk. It's my favorite part of writing a book, actually. Writing the book is great, but when the book is done, I'm done with it. You know what I mean? It's out there now. And so having people write in, having people ask questions and want to engage and stuff, it's just endlessly satisfying. And that was really the point of the book. I mean, I just wanted to start a conversation because I love talking. And having this ongoing conversation that was going in our family now extended to whoever wants to read the book is so satisfying to me.
Wonderful. I think what resonates with me so much is this pattern. I feel like is just such a powerful one of posing the question and then that deep meditation on it, just trying to get as much information as you can on it. And I love what you're doing and asking and inviting and prompting people to do the same. I think it's incredible work, truly.
Well, thank you so much. If everybody just does what they can, I mean, the same thing with the podcast, you know what I mean? Like this podcast has obviously reached so many people and uplifted and inspired. And I love our community because this is what we do, right? We leverage our talents. I can write a little bit. You're charismatic and engaging, and you do a podcast and you bring people out and you give that to and it's almost kind of like the Ward family where you're like, hey, you're pretty good at music. Hey, you can teach. Hey, you're really good with youth. Let's all kick in and let's do this and make the world better. And it's again, the magic of our people, it's the magic of our community, which is just so great.
I agree.
Well, thank you too. It was my pleasure.
Thanks so much for spending time with me today. If you're looking for a family-friendly, refreshing drink, check out Soda Bears, my family's premium soda company. And for a faith-filled story to share with the little ones, don't miss Sheep Chronicles Baptism. Both are available on Amazon. Until next time, keep creating with purpose and faith.